The year was 1873, and in a dusty saloon on the edge of San Antonio, Texas, a crowd of cowboys and gamblers fell silent as a figure pushed through the wooden doors. He was young, barely in his 20s, with dark skin and eyes that had seen too much for someone his age. On his hip hung a Colt revolver that gleamed in the dim lamplight. Nobody knew his real name, so Makayed, Eam the Ghost. Others whispered Black Lightning, but everyone knew one thing for certain. This man had never lost a gunfight. What made his story even more incredible was where he came from. Just 5 years earlier, this same person had been someone's property, an enslaved boy working in the cotton fields of Mississippi with chains around his ankles and a master who beat him for sport. But something happened that changed everything. One night, under a moonless sky, he made a decision that would either lead to his freedom or his death. He ran. He ran west, where the law was weak, and a man could remake himself into whoever he wanted to be. But before we dive into how an enslaved child became the most feared gunslinger in Texas, make sure you hit that subscribe button because this story has twists you woe. Unsee coming, and I guarantee by the end you'll never forget his name. This is the true story of survival, revenge, and transformation, a story that the history books tried to bury, but one that deserves to be told. The cotton fields of Willow Creek Plantation stretched 4 miles under the burning Mississippi sun, and somewhere among those endless rows of white bowls worked a 12-year-old boy who had never known a day of freedom in his life. His name was Samuel, though the overseer called him boy, or worse things that shouldn't be repeated. Every morning before dawn, he woke up in a cramped wooden cabin with 15 other enslaved people, their bodies aching from the previous day's labor. His mother had died when he was 8, taken by fever and exhaustion, and his father had been sold away to a plantation in Alabama when Samuel was too young to remember his face. The master of Willow Creek, a cruel man named Cyrus Blackwood, was known throughout the county for his brutality. He believed that fear kept his workers in line, and he used his whip freely to prove his point. Samuel had felt that whip more times than he could count the scars on his back, telling stories of punishments for working too slow for looking, Blackwood in the eye for simply existing in a way that displeased the master. But Samuel was different from the other enslaved people on the plantation. He had a fire inside him that would undie no matter how many times Blackwood tried to break his spirit. Late at night, when everyone else was too exhausted to move, Samuel would lie awake on his thin mattress and dream of a place he'd heard whispers about: Texas. The older men on the plantation talked about it in hushed voices when the overseers weren't listening. They said Texas was where the law didn't reach as far, where a black man might have a chance to disappear into the wild frontier and build a new life. They said it was dangerous, full of outlaws and Indian territory. But to Samuel, danger sounded better than the certainty of dying in these cotton fields before he turned 30. The breaking point came on a sweltering July evening in 1868. Samuel had been working since sunrise, his hands bleeding from picking cotton under the watchful eye of the overseer. As the sun began to set, Blackwood himself rode out on his horse to inspect the day's work. He was drunk, as he often was by evening, and he was in a foul mood because cotton prices had dropped. He needed someone to blame, and his eyes fell on Samuel. Without warning or reason, Blackwood dismounted and grabbed his whip. He accused Samuel of being lazy, of not picking enough cotton, of having an attitude that needed correcting. The first lash cut across Samuel's shoulders, tearing through his thin shirt. The second drew blood. By the third strike, something inside Samuel's mind snapped like a dry twig. That night, while Blackwood slept off his whiskey in the big house, and the other enslaved people tried to rest their broken bodies, Samuel made his decision. He had no plan, no map, no supplies. All he knew was that if he stayed, Blackwood would eventually kill him, either quickly with a bullet or slowly with a whip in the fields. He waited until midnight, when even the dogs had stopped barking, and he slipped out of the cabin. He took nothing with him except the clothes on his back and a small knife he'd de-stolen from the kitchen months earlier. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. Every snap of a twig under his feet sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. He moved through the darkness like a shadow, heading west toward a freedom he couldn't even imagine, knowing that if they caught him, death would be the kindest punishment he could hope for. Samuel walked for 3 weeks through forests, swamps, and open prairie, moving only at night and hiding during the day. He ate whatever he could find: wild berries, roots. Once a rabbit he managed to catch with his bare hands. His feet bled through his worn shoes, and mosquitoes feasted on his skin until he was covered in welts. Twice he heard the sound of dogs in the distance, slave catchers hunting runaways, and both times he waded through creeks for hours to throw them off his scent. He crossed from Mississippi into Louisiana, then into the edge of Texas, each step taking him further from the only world he'd ever known. When he finally stumbled into a small frontier town called Dusty Ridge on the outskirts of San Antonio, he was half dead from exhaustion and starvation. His clothes were torn to rags, his body was skeletal, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd seen hell. A Mexican family found him collapsed near their small ranch on the edge of town. The father, a man named Carlos Mendoza, could have turned Samuel in for the reward money that surely existed for a runaway slave. Instead, Carlos and his wife Maria saw a boy who needed help. They brought him into their home, fed him, and let him recover his strength. Carlos had his own reasons for distrusting the Lajes family had lived in Texas when it was still part of Mexico, and the new American authorities treated Mexicans almost as poorly as they treated black people. Over the next few months, Samuel worked on the Mendoza ranch, helping with horses and cattle, learning Spanish words mixed with English, and slowly building back the weight and muscle he'd lost during his escape. It was Carlos who taught Samuel his first lessons with a gun. On the frontier, every man needed to know how to shoot for hunting, for protection from bandits, and sometimes for protection from the law itself. Carlos handed Samuel an old Colt revolver one afternoon and took him out to a clearing behind the ranch. The gun felt heavy and foreign in Samuel's hands at first. Carlos showed him how to load it, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger gently. Instead of jerking it, the first shot knocked Samuel backward and left his ears ringing. He missed the target completely. But something about that moment, the power, the noise, the feeling of holding something that could make other men afraid awakened. Something deep inside him. For the first time since leaving the plantation, Samuel felt like he might have a chance at survival. Every day after his work was done, Samuel practiced. He set up bottles and cans on fence posts and fired until his hands were sore and his fingers were black with gunpowder. Carlos watched with growing amazement as the boy's natural talent revealed itself. Wheating Mom Samuel could hit targets that seasoned cowboys missed. His hands were quick, his eyes were sharp, and he had something that couldn't be taught to absolute focus. When Samuel held a gun, all the fear and pain and anger from his years in bondage channeled into a single point of deadly concentration. Carlos began to worry about what he'd created. He warned Samuel that being good with a gun in Texas meant men would eventually test you. That reputation was a burden as much as a blessing. But Samuel wasn't thinking about reputation. He was thinking about the fact that no one would ever put chains on him again. He was thinking about becoming someone that men like Cyrus Blackwood would fear. He was thinking about transformation, about shedding the skin of that enslaved boy and becoming something new, something dangerous, something free. Samuel had been in Texas for nearly 2 years when everything changed on a hot Saturday afternoon in a saloon called the Broken Spur. He'd been working odd jobs around San Antonio, breaking horses, doing ranch work, and keeping his head down. He'd grown taller and stronger, his boyish frame now hardened by frontier life and constant practice with his revolver. Most people in town knew him only as Sam, a quiet young man who didn't talk much about his past. The Mendoza family had given him the gift of anonymity, and he protected it carefully. But on this particular day, his past and present were about to collide in the worst possible way. The saloon was crowded with cowboys, gamblers, and drifters spending their wages on whiskey and card games. Samuel sat alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of water and minding his own business. He'd learned that saloons were dangerous places for someone like him, a black man in a territory where many folks still believed in the old ways, where the Civil War had ended slavery on paper but not in people's hearts. He was about to leave when 3 men walked through the door, loud and drunk and looking for trouble. The biggest one, a red-faced cowboy named Jack Turnbull, had a reputation as a bully and a racist who enjoyed humiliating anyone he considered beneath him. Turnbull's eyes scanned the room and landed on Samuel. A cruel smile spread across his face as he elbowed his friends and pointed. They walked over to Samuel's table, boots heavy on the wooden floor, and Turnbull kicked the chair across from Samuel, sending it clattering against the wall. The saloon went quiet. Everyone knew what was coming. Turnbull leaned on the table and said words that don't need repeating, calling Samuel names that referenced slavery and suggesting he did unbelong in a place where white men drank. He demanded Samuel get on his knees and apologize for breathing the same air as decent folk. His friends laughed and encouraged him, enjoying the show. Samuel sat perfectly still, his hands flat on the table, his heart racing but his face calm. He'd spent years being called names, being treated as less than human, being told to bow and scrape before men who weren't fit to shine his shoes. The old Samuel, the enslaved boy from Mississippi, would have lowered his eyes and taken the abuse. But that boy was dead. The person sitting at this table had walked through hell to get here, had transformed himself into someone new, and he wasn't going to kneel for anyone ever again. He looked up at Turnbull and spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried through the silent saloon. He told Turnbull to walk away while he still could. The words hung in the air, like smoke. Turnbull's face turned purple with rage. Nobody talked to him that way, especially not someone he considered property. He stepped back and put his hand on his gun, issuing a challenge that everyone understood. Draw or be shot like a dog. The entire saloon held its breath. Samuel stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. His right hand hung loose at his side, inches from the Colt revolver on his hip. Time seemed to slow down. He could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every person's eyes on him, could sense that whatever happened in the next few seconds would define the rest of his life. Turnbull's hand moved first, reaching for his gun with the confidence of a man who'd won a dozen saloon fights. But Samuel's hand moved faster, so fast that witnesses later said they barely saw it. The Colt cleared leather like lightning. The barrel came up smooth and sure, and Samuel fired once. The bullet hit Turnbull in the chest before his gun even cleared the holster. The big cowboy's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief as he stumbled backward, crashed into a table, and collapsed onto the wooden floor. The saloon erupted in chaos. Turnbull's friends reached for their weapons, but froze when they saw Samuel's gun already aimed in their direction, steady as stone. The bartender shouted for everyone to stay calm. Someone ran to fetch the sheriff. Samuel stood there, smoke still rising from his revolver, his hand trembling now that the moment had passed. He'd just killed a man. The reality of it hit him like a physical blow, but there was no time to process the weight of what he'd done. The sheriff arrived within minutes, a grizzled old lawman named Tom Wheeler who'd seen plenty of saloon shootings in his years. He questioned witnesses, examined Turnbull's body, and listened to a dozen men all tell the same story Turnbull had drawn first. The young black man had fired in self-defense. Wheeler looked at Samuel for a long moment, then told him he was free to go, but suggested he might want to leave town for a while until things cooled down. Turnbull had family and friends who wouldn't care about self-defense or justice. They'd want revenge, and the law wouldn't always be around to stop him. Samuel took the sheriff's advice and left San Antonio that very night, heading deeper into the Texas frontier where towns were smaller and law was scarcer. But something unexpected happened in the days and weeks that followed. The story of the saloon shooting spread like wildfire across Texas. Cowboys and ranchers talked about it around campfires. Newspaper reporters wrote sensational accounts that exaggerated the details. Within a month, Samuel had become a legend he never asked to be. They said he was the fastest gun in Texas. They said he'd killed 5 men in that saloon, not one. They said he never missed a shot, never showed fear, never backed down from any challenge. The rumors grew bigger and wilder with each telling, and Samuel's real story of an enslaved boy who de-escaped and learned to survive got buried under layers of frontier mythology. Men began seeking him out. Some were genuinely curious, wanting to see if the stories were true. Others were young gunslingers trying to make their own reputations by outdrawing the famous Black Lightning, a nickname someone had given Samuel that stuck like glue. In the town of Rio Vista, a cocky gunman named Dale Morrison called Samuel out in the street, and Samuel had no choice but to accept the challenge or be shot in the back. He won that duel with another impossibly fast draw. 2 months later, in a place called Copper Creek, 3 brothers ambushed him outside a general store, and he managed to wound all 3 without taking a bullet himself. Each victory added to his legend, and each legend brought more challengers. Samuel hated it. He'd never wanted to be a killer or a gunfighter. All he'd wanted was freedom and peace, a chance to live without fear. But the frontier had different plans for him. His skill with a gun, the very thing that had saved his life in that saloon, had become a curse that followed him from town to town. He couldn't settle anywhere because his reputation arrived before he did. Saloon owners would ask him to leave because his presence attracted trouble. Sheriffs would suggest he move along before someone got killed. Regular work became impossible because nobody wanted to hire the famous gunslinger who might bring violence to their ranch or business. Despite his growing reputation and the respect his gun earned him, Samuel carried wounds that no bullet had made. Late at night, when he was alone in some cheap hotel room or camping under the Texas stars, the memories came flooding back. He'd close his eyes and see his mother's face, exhausted and hollow from years of picking cotton in the Mississippi heat. He'd remember the sound of the whip cutting through air before it bit into flesh. He'd hear the screams of other enslaved people being punished, the crying of children being sold away from their families, the hopeless prayers whispered in the darkness of the cabin. These memories were ghosts that haunted him far more than any living enemy could. The violence of his new life troubled him deeply. Every man he'd killed in self-defense, every duel he'd won, every bullet he'd fired, they all added weight to his soul. He'd see their faces sometimes, even Turnbull's shocked expression in those final seconds. Samuel had never wanted to be a killer. He'd wanted to be free, to be safe, to maybe have a family someday and live a normal life. Instead, he'd become exactly what he'd always feared: someone who solved problems with violence, someone known for death rather than life. The irony was unlost on him that he de-escaped one form of brutality only to become trapped in another. On the plantation, violence had been done to him. Now, he was the one delivering it, even if every shot was fired in self-defense. He thought often about the family he'd left behind in Mississippi. Did they think he was dead? Had anyone else tried to escape after he'd run? Had Master Blackwood taken out his rage on the others, punishing them for Samuel's defiance? The guilt of not knowing ate at him. He'd saved himself, but abandoned everyone else to their fate. Sometimes he fantasized about going back, about using his skills with a gun to free them all, but he knew it was an impossible dream. One man, no matter how fast with a revolver, couldn't take on an entire system of slavery and oppression. The best he could do was survive and prove that a black man could be more than property, could command respect, even in a world designed to deny him humanity. Texas in the 1870s was still a deeply racist place. Yes, slavery had ended, but freedom on paper didn't mean equality in reality. Samuel faced constant reminders that many white people saw him as less than human. He was refused service in restaurants, turned away from hotels, cursed at on the street. The only reason men didn't try to push him around or humiliate him anymore was the gun on his hip and the reputation that came with it. His freedom was maintained through fear, not through any real change in how people thought about someone with his skin color. It was exhausting, living every day knowing that respect came only from the threat of violence. That, without his gun, he'd be right back to being treated like he was on the plantation. The psychological toll of this existence began to show. Samuel drank more than he should, trying to quiet the voices in his head. He became withdrawn and suspicious, trusting almost no one. The few friendships he attempted to build fell apart because he couldn't let anyone get too close, couldn't risk them learning about his past or seeing the broken parts of him he kept hidden. He was trapped between two worlds, no longer enslaved, but never truly free. Respected for his gun, but hated for his skin. Feared by many, but known by none. Samuel had been drifting through Texas for almost 5 years, when his past finally caught up with him in the summer of 1873. He was staying in a small town called Redemption, working as a security guard for a cattle auction, when a stranger rode into town, asking questions about a black gunslinger. The stranger's name was Clayton Moss, a bounty hunter from Mississippi, and he wasn't alone. He'd brought 4 other men with him, all experienced killers who worked for money rather than principle. But Moss wasn't working for himself this time. He'd been hired by someone with deep pockets and a long memory: Cyrus Blackwood, Samuel's former master. Blackwood had never forgotten the enslaved boy who'd escaped his plantation. For 5 years, the old man had nursed his hatred and his humiliation, spending a fortune on trackers and bounty hunters trying to find Samuel. Most trails had gone cold, but then stories about a black gunslinger in Texas started reaching Mississippi. Blackwood heard the tales of lightning-fast draws and impossible shots, and something told him this wasn't just any freed slave making a name for himself. When he heard that this gunslinger was about Samuel's age, and had appeared in Texas around the same time his property had run away, Blackwood knew in his bones that he'd found his target. He was too old and sick to make the journey himself, so he sent Moss with instructions that were crystal clear: bring the boy back alive if possible, but dead was acceptable. Word reached Samuel through a sympathetic bartender who'd overheard Moss talking. The bounty hunter had made no secret of his purpose: telling anyone who listened that he was there to collect a runaway slave and collect a handsome reward. The news hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. He'd known this day might come, had feared it in his darkest moments. But hoping something won't happen doesn't make you ready when it does. All the running, all the transformation, all the years of building a new identity, none of it had been enough to escape the chains of his past. Blackwood's reach extended even here, hundreds of miles from Mississippi, proving that in America, a black man's freedom was always temporary, always conditional, always one slave catcher away from being revoked. Samuel had three choices. He could run again, disappear deeper into the frontier, or maybe head to Mexico where American law meant nothing. He could turn himself in, though he knew Blackwood would either kill him slowly or make his remaining years a living hell as an example to other enslaved, people who might think about escaping. Or he could stand and fight, could face the men Blackwood sent, and end this chapter of his life once and for all. For the first time since that night he'd fled the plantation, Samuel chose to stop running. He was tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of being afraid, tired of letting Cyrus Blackwood control his life, even from hundreds of miles away. If this was where his journey ended, then at least it would end on his terms, with a gun in his hand and his head held high. He sent word to Clayton Moss that he'd meet him and his men at noon the next day in the street outside the town's main saloon. The whole town buzzed with tension as news of the impending showdown spread. The sheriff tried to intervene, tried to arrest Moss for disturbing the peace, but the bounty hunter had papers signed by Mississippi authorities claiming legal right to capture escaped property. The law, as always, was complicated when it came to black freedom. The next day, under a blazing Texas sun, Samuel stood alone in the dusty street while Clayton Moss and his 4 hired guns spread out in a line facing him. The town's residents watched from windows and doorways, holding their breath as history prepared to write itself in gunpowder and blood. Samuel's hand hung steady near his Colt revolver, and for a brief moment, he thought about that 12-year-old boy in the cotton fields who dreamed of freedom. He'd come so far, survived so much, and transformed himself from property into a legend. Whether he walked away from this street or died on it, one thing was absolutely certain: he would never be enslaved again. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, Clayton Moss lay dead in the dirt with a bullet through his heart. 2 of his men were wounded, and the other 2 had fled on horseback, deciding that no amount of money was worth facing the fastest gun they'd ever seen. Samuel stood untouched, his revolver still smoking in his hand. The sheriff ruled it self-defense and told the surviving bounty hunters to leave Texas and never come back. News of the showdown eventually reached Mississippi, and when Cyrus Blackwood heard that his hired guns had failed and his best bounty hunter was dead, something broke inside the old man. He died 3 months later, bitter and defeated, never having reclaimed the property that haunted his final years. Samuel continued drifting through Texas for several more years, his legend growing even larger after the showdown in Redemption. Some say he eventually settled in Mexico under a different name, married a woman from a small village, and lived out his days in peace, never touching a gun again. Others claim he became a lawman in a frontier town, using his skills to protect people instead of just himself. A few stories insist he died in one final gunfight in 1879, going down in a blaze of glory that cemented his place in Western folklore. The truth is that Samuel simply disappeared from historical records, which perhaps was exactly what he wanted: to finally fade into anonymity, to be forgotten, to live without the weight of reputation or the shadow of his past. But his story remains important because it reveals a truth that history often tries to hide. The Old West wasn't just white cowboys and Native American conflicts. It was also black people seeking freedom, reinventing themselves on the frontier, and fighting for dignity in a country that denied them basic humanity. Samuel was one of thousands of formerly enslaved people who fled west after the Civil War, though few had his particular talents or his dramatic story. He proved that freedom wasn't given, it was taken, defended, and sometimes paid for in blood. The enslaved boy from Mississippi became Texas's most feared gunslinger, not because he loved violence, but because violence was the only language that a racist society understood. His gun earned him the respect that his humanity should have granted him automatically. And in the end, that's both his triumph and America's tragedy.